You are listening to I Am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
I am Interchange.
Fostering curiosity, education, and empathy by exploring the controversial and the provocative.
I am Interchange.
Successful artist and children's book author, Eddie Hemingway is no stranger to the limelight, but he's never felt at home there. As the son of Valerie Danby-Smith and Gregory Hemingway, and the grandson of renowned author Ernest Hemingway, Eddie's relatively solitary private Catholic school upbringing in New York segued seamlessly into a fine arts degree at Rhode Island School of Design and solidified a creative, empathic introvert. While Eddie actively cultivates personal space and values the introspection it affords in both his personal and professional spheres, his compassion, curiosity, gentle humor, perceptiveness, and love of intimate connection are equally defining. I'm Tate Chamberlin, and in this podcast, Eddie and I delve into his consciously intentional life, from the challenges of his past and successes of his present works and new release, Pigeon and Cat. We're with author and artist Edward Hemingway right now. Ed, what kind of toys did you have as a kid? One of our topics is this intergenerational piece called OK Boomer, and it's been interesting to see what kind of toys people had through the different generations.
Totally. Well, I'm Gen X, right? We played a lot of board games. I mean, obviously my absolute favorite was Operation, which is such an incredible object, right?
The little tweezers.
And it's that doofy guy, the doofus guy who just looks kind of...
He's got the red light nose.
Yeah. And just being able to pick out the little organs inside. And I love, and I love that. It's so visceral and so bizarre, but also my dad was a doctor, so he had lots of medical books lying around. And I was, as a kid, obsessed with looking at them. I mean, I was terrified, but also fascinated by looking at these diseases or looking at the interiors of the body. Kind of thrilling. And there was something thrilling about Operation because as you would put your tweezers in, there's the chance of the buzzing, which was such a kind of loud, crazy noise. But certainly my favorite personal toy, not a game, was my Snoopy. I had a stuffed Snoopy. It's about yay high.
Did you keep its name Snoopy?
It was Snoopy, yeah. I was like fully invested in the whole Charles Schulz empire, and I kept his name. And he had the Red Baron was his character that he would play. Character. And so I had this great outfit for him that I could put on.
With a scarf?
With a scarf.
And like the cool goggles.
Yeah, totally. And the hat, it's all like kind of in brown leather. And I kind of just enjoyed that he had a couple of outfits. I think he might have even had a denim outfit too.
Very versatile.
That I might be making up, but he definitely he had the other one. And I wore him out. I had him, I would carry him everywhere. And yeah, I loved my Snoopy, and I loved the Snoopy shows, which I actually recently watched, and they still hold up, I think.
We were talking about Blaine Halverson and his company Junk Food a little bit ago. And I was just wondering if there's a food that you're most ashamed of someone catching you eating.
Oh my God. Like pretty much any food. I hate people seeing me eat. Recently, I got a bunch of healthy food. I kind of go in phases where I'll eat really well, and I know what I should be eating, and yet I always find myself falling into that trap of eating something. I would probably say, without a doubt, McDonald's. Like if you see me with a McDonald's bag, I would be like mortified, and that does happen occasionally.
Quick, tuck it under my shirt.
I know, it's like, but the smell is like such a giveaway, right? I am a victim to their French fries occasionally.
We spent a lot of the pandemic together.
We did.
What's the pandemic been like for you?
Gosh, it's funny. I was just talking to someone outside about how yesterday I went to the post office, and I'm definitely one of these people, when there's a list of things I need to do or ways in which I need to be careful, I can get really obsessed with adhering to them. And my partner is also like a total germaphobe. So in a way, I'm kind of meeting him. Like he was in such a high place with taking care of himself, like and germs and all that, and it never really concerned me at all. So I feel like now we're kind of much closer. But so yesterday I had to mail something, and it was the very first time since this whole pandemic started that I actually went into the post office because I was in a rush and I didn't have my mask on. And this guy was coming out with a mask on, and he gave me this look, and I was like, oh my God, like, and so I ran out and put one on, but that's the first time that's happened. It's easy to kind of want to fall into old patterns and go back to the way things were. And I think so many people want normalcy, but there's kind of going to be a new normal for a while.
What are you missing out on most because of it?
Well, I think obviously we were going to go to a wedding in Mexico. We were going to go for 5 days and to Cabo San Lucas, which is a place that some friends of mine are getting married, and which got canceled and isn't happening now. But we used to go every summer. That was something that we did as a family. So I was actually really looking forward to going back down and seeing it. And I was also excited to celebrate my friend's wedding. And so, things like weddings, my niece's graduation, those were things that didn't end up happening the way they were supposed to. And I think, that's hard. That said, I feel like, there's so much positive that comes out of it too, in the sense that it kind of makes you realize what's important. I think having to, put yourself and others first, and then also spend a lot of time with yourself and maybe your work. And anytime there's strong adversity, it's a chance to test yourself and try to make the best of it, which is kind of life in a nutshell, but this feels more saturated, I guess.
You brought up isolation. What's been your experience around isolation?
I am, by nature, I can be kind of a loner, and my partner's a loner too, so it's interesting. We spend a lot of time together, but we also have created a lot of our own personal space in our lives, and I think I'm that way also with my friends. I really value that time that I get to spend on my own, but that said, it's so important for me, especially as an author and an artist, to be able to create it around other people, because the very nature of, I think, making art and writing is pretty, it can be pretty lonely work. I've always tried to have a space, a creative space that had a community, because otherwise you would spend like pretty much almost all your time alone. And so Blunderbuss has been really nice for me in that way. Even just the fact that, say, like my last studio space, which I shared with 4 other children's book authors. We were in one big room. We each had sort of a cubicle area, which was nice. But what I like about Blunderbuss is we actually all have our own, so there is a cubicle area. I actually have my own space that's separate from everyone. But I do, even just the act of walking you through the space and seeing other people and seeing you. And otherwise, if you say I had a studio, and I've had studios in my, in New York when I lived there, in my apartments, or, when we moved out here, though, it was really essential to me to have a space, and a space with other artists.
You moved from Brooklyn a couple of years ago to Montana, and your studio while you were in Brooklyn was the shared space, and then Montana opened up landscape wise, but also gave you a little breathing room with a workspace. Definitely.
No, one thing I always say, which is maybe a bit of a pat expression, but I feel like when we want to be alone, in New York, you kind of have to go into the interior. You have to kind of find a space to get away from just there's so many people and there's so much like going on. I mean, probably that's changed a little bit right now, but so real estate was always so key in finding a decent place or finding a nice space. And like, you're kind of like, a lot of times I was taking public transportation, like buses and the subway to get from my house to my studio. And here, I feel in Montana, a beautiful thing is that to be alone here, you just have to go outside. There's so much space. And even just my commute from here to where I live is such a joy. And sometimes I would try and bike in New York. It's the most preferred probably way to get around, except that, I also suffer from anxiety, and it was not helping with that, riding a bike in New York. So here, though, I love, like, my drive to work is incredible. The big event of my week is we're going to drive up Bridger Canyon to see my old place where I grew up. Cool. When we moved out here, we're right around the 10-mile marker. And then someone just Instagrammed me yesterday. They were like, have you been up to where you grew up? Like your house is the only one that's still standing. Because apparently there was, we all saw the fires, but I didn't realize that a whole bunch around there had burned.
Tell me a little bit about your parents.
Yes. My parents, actually, the reason why I'm probably here right now talking to you, well, obviously for me, the main reason that my mother gave birth to me, but before that, or after that, my parents moved out here when I was 11. My father had actually moved out 5 years before. He was a general practitioner, and moved to Jordan, Montana.
Where's that?
Jordan, Montana is where Jack Horner found a bunch of dinosaur bones. I was only there once as a small child because my mother wanted us to live in a larger city when she was finally convinced that we should move out here as well. And so we came straight to Bozeman. But my father, you know, he had been a doctor in New York and Miami, and I think he had grown up partly in Cuba because my grandfather was Ernest Hemingway, and my dad grew up so in the house that my family had in Key West, but spent a lot of time in the Montana area growing up too. And because also I think my grandfather at one point was hospitalized in Billings for some reason or another. I think he broke an arm or a leg. I think this was an arm, just judging from a picture I remember. But he had loved Montana. So I think my father had always had a desire to come back here. And one of my uncles, my father's older brother, Patrick, who still lives here, he was the one who first moved him and his daughter, his family out here. And he had been a hunter in Africa. And after he left, sort of really wanted to live somewhere that had the similar terrain and the same types of hunting opportunities and such. And so he was really drawn to Montana and Bozeman. And so then we came out shortly after. And it's funny because my mother, Valerie, who you've met and had tea with, she's Irish, from Ireland, from Dublin, and came to America when she was in her teens. Actually met my grandfather and worked for him as a secretary until shortly before he died. She left working for him, but so she spent a lot of time with him in Cuba.
Is that how your parents met?
Well, my parents met, funnily enough. My father and my grandfather, in the last few years of my grandfather's life, were estranged. So my mother wouldn't have met him at that time, except that when my grandfather died, my mother went out to his funeral, and she was on her way to the funeral and met my father. And the story that my father writes in his book, which my mother says is like 90% accurate, is she was walking because I guess she got off the plane and there weren't any cabs, and she just decided to walk to the event, to the funeral, and my father saw her walking along the side of the road. He said he saw this tall drink of water in a pair of blue jeans, dungarees, and he had to pick her up. And then, of course, my mother was like, well, I'd never worn jeans in my life. So I already know that part of the story isn't true.
That's really funny.
I know, right? But it is sort of interesting that they met there. And I think they had, because my father and my grandfather at that time were so I've been told, were estranged. And because my mother, wasn't an actual family member, and she was also a freelance reporter, I think they were both kind of like odd people out at the ceremony. And certainly I think there was a slight distrust on my step-grandmother Mary's side, worried that my mother might be writing about the funeral for publication. Yeah. And then because my father was, such a bad boy, anyway, I think they ended up bonding.
Your father was a bad boy?
Oh, he was a bad boy, yes. He liked to party, and at that point, he and my grandfather had, and it's all in, my father wrote a book. I was telling you this another day, how both my parents have written books, and sort of both of them were about my grandfather.
Yeah, so both your parents have written memoirs. What's it like to see inside your parents so deeply?
A memoir is an interesting thing. It's it's not a history book, right? It's people's views and opinions on their experiences. It's filtered through their eyes and through how they see things. So it's not necessarily the facts, right? But it is, like you say, it's a real window into who they are. As a child of a parent, we don't necessarily see our parents in a completely well-rounded way. They had specific roles, and they also, I think, presented themselves as specific people in specific roles, expecting a certain amount of respect and also a certain amount of discretion. And also both my parents were very private people. So interestingly, my father wrote his book in 1976. It was published first. And then my mother's book came out in the early aughts. So there's a huge huge spanning of time between them.
Was it like a rebuttal?
No, well, they're very different. Both memoirs and both reflecting their personalities, and that my father's was very short and sweet, but very powerful and emotional. And then my mother's was much longer and much more considered and careful, which actually is kind of representing the two personalities. They're very, very different people. As a son of parents who were very private people and also very private about their relationship with my grandfather, who really is like the sun in which all these planets of my family seem to kind of rotate around, because he, had such an impact on not only American culture, but my parents' generation and my generation, and then probably my brother and sister's children's as well. I think my first reaction, certainly to my father's book came out, I was pretty young, so I think it was just something he did. And I remember literally the thing that I took from it was that he was just kind of a bastard when he was writing it, because he had to be sort of, he had to have everything be quiet, and we were little kids running around. And, as his writing process, I was very much a part of and aware of, because he was doing it in the house while we were there. And he was normally, as a doctor, he was usually off working, and then we'd see him occasionally. So, but the time that he wrote his book, for part of it, he was at home a lot, and we of course all wanted attention. And so he I think the only time he ever physically hit me was when he was writing the book and I was banging pots and pans.
Grabbing onto his leg.
I know, I'm not a parent, but I guess I really can't blame him for just whacking me, but not that I would recommend anyone do that to their children.
That kind of old school.
There's an amazing preface to it. Can I read
Sure.
it to you? This is, my grandfather wrote this, and he wrote this was in Islands in the Stream, which was published posthumously, but it was a book that my grandfather had been working on, and I don't think he quite finished it before he died, but it was published, and it really was very autobiographical. And it was about this artist who had 3 children, and the youngest, and they were obviously based after his kids. And so he wrote this about my father. And I remember as a small child reading this quote from this book and thinking, that my grandfather had written this about my father. And it made me realize that he was an incredible writer. I just knew that from reading it, because it so captured my father. But it also shocked me, because I found it so honest and in some ways very beautiful, but also negative. And in my family, there had never been that kind of honesty. And to see that my father had grown up with that was so interesting. And I love it today. It actually gives me shivers. So here we go. The smallest boy was fair and was built like a pocket battleship. He was a copy of Thomas Hudson physically, reduced in scale and widened and shortened. His skin freckled when it tanned, and he had a humorous face and was born being very old. He was a devil, too, and deviled both his older brothers. And he had a dark side in him that nobody except Thomas Hudson could ever understand. Neither of them thought about this, except that they recognized in each other and knew it was bad, and that the man respected it and understood the boy's having it. They were very close to each other, and although Thomas Hudson had never been as much with this boy as with the others, this youngest boy, Andrew, was a precocious, excellent athlete, and he had been marvelous with horses since he had first ridden. The other boys were very proud of him, but they did not want any nonsense from him either. He was a little unbelievable, and anyone could well have doubted his feats, except that many people had seen him ride and watched him jump and seen his cold, professional modesty. He was a boy born to be quite wicked, who was being very good, and he carried his wickedness around inside him, transmuted into a sort of teasing gaiety. But he was a bad boy, and the others knew it, and he knew it. He was just being good, while his badness grew inside him.
Whoa.
I was such a young kid when I read that, but I understood, there had always been all this talk about Ernest Hemingway, who I never met, and, your grandfather's famous, and your grandfather's this incredible writer, and, that was the first moment that I personally understood that he was. But it was also a little bit terrifying for me, because that was the first time I think I'd ever seen a father write about a son in such a way that wasn't, it's wonderful because, especially the older I get, I see there's so much beauty in it, and it's kind of almost an acknowledgement of a kindred spirit. And that's what he's writing about. But also it's not like puppy dogs, and it's really recognizing a darkness in yourself, in your child, and almost presenting it in a, I believe, kind of very honest, but also slightly poetic and kind of devastating way. Anyway, so that was that was my father's book, and there's a lot in it. It's short, but there's a lot in it that's very emotional, and it's a little heartbreaking because they have their differences. And my father, I think, for all his privilege, had a bit of a tough childhood. And I think anyone with a artists, we're very selfish in a lot of ways. And, I think the work can come first. And I think family members can suffer for that. I think my father was loved, and I think he was, he had clothes on his back, but he had a tough time of it. But that's the one thing I also, in retrospect, I'm so impressed with my dad for. I think it was the only thing my grandfather ever wrote that was sort of overtly about my father that was obvious. But I love that's the forward in his book. That's the quote that he opens his book with. And my mother's book, which I don't have with me, I'm sure she probably had a quote as well. But hers was so interesting because she was very private of her relationship with my grandfather. And it was, I think, I can honestly say probably she gave me the impression that it was the most important one that she'd had in her life. I kind of understood as a child that my grandfather, had literally brought my parents together, and that both of them had these incredible close relationships with him at some point in their lives. And I think in some ways, whether they liked it or not, also defined who they were to, other people and how they were viewed by other people in their life, whether they wanted to be that way or not. And so, writing a book about it is also one way of just addressing it. But no, my mother's book, also touches on so much on her relationship with Ernest, and then goes in a lot into her relationship with my father and the aftermath of their marriage and what she had to go through with him.
Let's fast forward to your existence. What was your education like?
So I had my mother being from modest upbringing in Ireland, coming to America, one of her biggest sort of desires was for her children to have like the best education possible. And so, I would say, I grew up in New York City and went to a small private school called St. David's, which was all boys. And it's funny, I went back there several years ago, and the whole thing it was like three large buildings connected. And I went back and it seemed so tiny. At the time, it was like, it felt like Hogwarts or something. Definitely not when I returned. But it was a pretty strict Catholic school. And my mother, Irish Catholic, was very important to her that we had religious upbringing. My sister went to the Sacred Heart, which is across the street from St. David's. And then my brother and I both went to St. David's, and which is where John F. Kennedy Jr. went for, I think, a year or two. And the Shaw's son was there at the time. I remember my brother went to a birthday party with the Shaw's son, and the birthday party was at several different locations because I think they didn't think it was safe to be in one place for too long. I know, but that's totally a story that my brother told me, so it's not necessarily true.
So if you weren't a writer, what would you be?
I weren't a writer. My first memory is that I wanted to be an astronaut. I literally remember being in a onesie and holding the cage of the crib and just imagining myself in a spacesuit on the moon. And I was like, how random is that? Because I've never really had that desire before or since. And but of course, I was a child right at the time of the moon landing. So I think it was probably just on the television or something in the background. Or my parents. I made that revelation recently, but it's funny. I did continue with my education. I then went away to boarding school in Rhode Island, and one of my teachers there, my art teacher there, was very supportive of me going to art college, and I ended up going to RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, which was amazing. And I had of course, I think part of being an artist too is then unlearning your education. But I don't deny that I was very lucky to have this incredible expensive education that took me a long time to pay off. But still, it was a really great experience. And I think, if I hadn't been a writer or artist, I would probably be doing the other things that I ended up doing when I wasn't able to make money from those things. I was a janitor. I worked in a coffee shop. I worked, painting for another artist, the artist assistant. I think all the odd jobs I've done have been to kind of help support me be an artist. And one thing that I will always be grateful to my parents for is that, for all their perceived faults, and we all have those with our parents, they both encouraged me to be an artist. I've always felt so lucky that my parents, had, I think because, of their relationship with my grandfather, both of them had seen an artist be incredibly successful in their own right. And I think they realized it was possible. I'm not living in a palace, and I never will. I tell people, if you go into picture books, it's, you're not going to be maybe rich and famous, but it's really not. I think most artists know this. It's not, the motivations aren't about, we all want success, but I think success as an artist is different than success as a stockbroker. For me, it's always been about reaching people. I mean, I would, and quantity does matter. You do want to reach a lot of people. It's fun to see when you've touched other people with your work. And then I had, in my family, I was able to see, it's amazing that my grandfather's works are still so important to people and that they're still read. I've done, either by myself or with other people, I've published like 11 books, and a handful of them are still in print and I get royalties from, but you realize it's like the survival in publishing can be tough, but when you do survive, it's a great feeling. And it's a little daunting when I look at the work of, say, since we're talking about families, of my grandfather, and to see the impact it's had and how it's still so successful. But that is that's heartening to me.
Do you have a favorite project or book that stands out to you?
Well, I think a lot of artists and writers say their favorite is what they're working on right now. And I mean, I would genuinely say that, yes, what I'm working on right now is my favorite. I think it has to be. I always think of books as almost like, I would imagine, not being a parent, but almost like children. You raise it, and like I've talked about the life cycle of a book. So there's this incredibly solitary time where, first there's the germ of an idea, and then the sort of creating a blueprint for it, and then you have to interact with your agent and get it sold. But then once that happens and you get an editor, and if they're a good editor, they'll be working with you, but they'll also be giving you space, because you need a little bit of both for that. That's a very solitary thing where you're working on a book for a while, and then in the life cycle of a book, you send in finishes and it goes off, gets edited, it goes off to a printer, it comes out. When it's published, there's this whole other aspect to it where you're actually, you're having to promote it, which for me is a lot of fun, because I think you spend so much time working on it and by yourself, and like a child, you're raising it and then you're bringing it out into the world, and you want it to get along with the other kids, and you want it to make you proud, and all those things that I would imagine you want with a child, right?
But don't be too popular, otherwise the other kids will hate you.
Exactly, and you don't want it to get bullied or picked on too much, but you wouldn't mind if it's popular, right? I mean, obviously, in the past, I think the first book I did that I was truly proud of was probably Bad Apple, Tale of Friendship.
I love that book.
Which is a great book,
Tell me more. Tell me more about it.
I know. So that book, Bad Apple, had been in an orchard, and I was with a friend of mine, and we just went, she wrote kids' books, and as well, and she got so delighted with there was some livestock at the orchard, and it was funny, she does a lot of books about animals, and I was sort of thinking, God, Sarah should write a book about the animals here at the orchard. And then I literally did come upon a rotten apple when we were picking, and I just remembered thinking, oh my God, a bad apple. And then when I said that phrase, I just thought, that's such a beautiful phrase and such a great idea for a book. Now, what would a bad apple be in my book? And so oddly enough, I thought about a relationship, and I thought about a relationship between a worm and an apple, and what would happen if a worm and an apple were to be friends? What would happen if your best friend ended up being such a best friend that they were inside your head, eating you? I know, which is funny, because to this day, some parents will still, or people on Goodreads or places where you read reviews will knock the book because they think it's about a bad relationship, or that it has negative connotations because the worm's eating the apple. I mean, the funny thing is it's a worm eating an apple. So I want to be well, first off, can we not project onto it the sense of it being a dysfunctional relationship? And he only eats a little bit of them. And the other thing is that I've never met a kid that didn't think it was hilarious, right? So it is, and it's funny because when the book came out, it wasn't universally accepted. It was, I remember, and I had a couple of terrible reviews. I had a great review in the New York Times, but Publishers Weekly trashed it. And I was devastated because I thought it was such a great story. And one of my mentors, Myra Coleman, who's this incredible children's book author and also does a lot of illustrations and done New Yorker covers many times. But she told me never read the bad reviews, and she's let go of them and don't think about them. But of course, they're the ones that you tend to remember, right? Or the negative things people say. But anyway, it was my first my first like terrible review. And I think it also scared a lot of librarians away from the book. But what I love about the book is that was like 10 years ago, 8 years ago. And it's really had a life. Like it's done really well because every year teachers use it, and a lot of teachers use it in their fall teaching programs. And there's all kinds of things online, workshops with it, and people come back to it every year. And I love that. And a lot of, it's really grown to have an audience, which is a great thing. And I recognize that thing of a book that because there were elements to it that were, potentially, you had to wrap your head around, like the idea of a worm, say, in an apple's head. Like some people thought that was gross, or, when I say people, I mean adults. Some of them thought it was, too creepy or what have you. But it's like that book always does make a small percentage of people uncomfortable, but I think that's a good thing. Like it's like when I first read those reviews and I was upset. Actually, now I look back and I'm like, well, I think I did something right, because it's something, I'd rather have that kind of reaction than them just being like, oh, it's just it's a silly story and who cares? Or it's just a kid's book, it's boring. It's like, it's great that I'd rather have people be like, well, that's kind of strange, and I'd rather have them think it's strange or think about it at all or have a strong reaction, I guess.
Speaking of strange, what's with the rumor about all of the Hemingway cats having 6 toes?
So that is actually, it's true. It's not a rumor.
It's not a rumor?
Fact. This is the Hemingway house in Key West. And the Hemingway house in Key West is this beautiful old house with like the first swimming pool that was ever built in Key West. My grandmother's uncle built for my grandmother and my grandfather when they were living there. And it's this beautiful, beautiful house with this big pool. And rumor has it, this is a rumor, that my grandfather was given a cat by a captain of a ship, a friend of his, who had a cat that was actually a cat on a boat. And apparently some captains have animals on boats that's like a sort of a mascot, if you will. And this cat had been a kitten born on a boat and actually had sea legs, but didn't have land legs. And a couple of different accounts of his name, but the name that I like the most is Snowball. And Snowball was 6-toed. He had these 6 toes, and it's apparently a genetic kind of thing. It's maybe almost not an aberration, but it's like a mutation. I don't know, but he had like 6 toes on each of his paws. And so he ended up living on the property and sired all these other cats. And so the descendants of the cats at the Hemingway house, many of them have these 6 toes. But it's a beautiful place. It's fun to just see where my father grew up in this crazy house that really was actually from the Pfeiffers, the Michelle Pfeiffer's father. No. So Pauline Pfeiffer's uncle actually, who's very wealthy, bought the house for them as a wedding gift. I believe a wedding gift. I've been thinking a lot about the story of Snowball, and one of the things I love about the story is that sort of different interpretations of whether this cat even existed, what his name was he a sea cat given by a captain? Is he the reason all the 6-toed cats exist in my grandfather's old home? And immediately, I love cats, and the book I'm working on right now, Pigeon and Cat, is about a pigeon and a cat, and actually a feral cat in Brooklyn. But I was thinking my next book, I'm kind of curious about doing a book about Snowball. And so I did a little research, and of course, I couldn't really come up with anything substantial. And then my mother claims, the cats, there weren't really many cats when she was there, and that your grandfather didn't really like cats. But so it was funny, because the more I kind of tried to find out about it, the more I realized that I was never going to get to the truth of it. And I love the idea of doing a book about this mythical Snowball. And because what my grandfather did was write wonderful fiction, a lot of it based on the truth, like that wonderful quote about my father. So I thought, what a great way to introduce kids to my grandfather and to the concept of fiction is to do a book about this cat. So much of great fiction comes from reality, but it's also blurred, what the lies are, who knows? And so I think, I don't know, I think it'd be fun to play around with this idea of Snowball and whether he even existed, and introduce like a whole new audience, a young audience, to my grandfather's work before they're going to read it when they're older. But it'd be fun to sort of introduce that to them.
The kids will get assigned or get gifted your book to read as part of class, and you'll go into the school and meet them. And that's often their first experience of a Hemingway book through yours, not Ernest.
Exactly. It's a small victory.
A small victory. Is that hard being in the shadows of him?
That's a question I do get asked a lot. And I think people in families with famous members, it is a double-edged sword. I mean, if I'm going to look at it in a blunt sort of way, it's double-edged in that it can get you attention and it can make you feel special, and those are nice things. They can be nice. But that doesn't mean jack shit, really, right? What really matters is what you can contribute and who you are, right? On one hand, I'm incredibly proud of who my grandfather was and the works that he did, which are brilliant, and just his intelligence and his creativity was mind-blowing to me on many levels. And I'll never be, who he is. I'll never have, the sort of type of career that he had. And yet at the same time, I will certainly have my own. No one can write a better, Edward Hemingway book than Edward Hemingway. And I just feel like I have to be authentic to who I am. And I think that one of the pratfalls of a famous relative is it can give you a false sense of importance or maybe even a false connection with people because they project onto you things that aren't you. And then that said, and that's the superficial part of it, because that's just what's on the surface. I mean, I think because for me, it'll always be, and my first reaction to your question is, well, he was my grandfather and I don't know anything else. So I feel like his fame or the large, the sort of large shadow that he casts on me it's not who I am, and it's not really applicable to what I do. So I do I guess I try and take the positive and then sort of forget about the negative.
Sure. I want to go back to Snowball really quick. You said Snowball was a gift. And when I was in Panama last year and you loaned me this copy of Old Man in the Sea that was signed by Giorgio Fuentes, who was the Old Man in the Sea, right?
Small caveat. Everyone thought he was the Old Man in the Sea because it's Gregorio Fuentes.
Gregorio.
But very close.
Gregorio.
The only thing is that Gregorio was 10 years younger than my grandfather. So I think my parents both felt like it was unlikely that my grandfather would have thought of him as the Old Man in the Sea. And so that he probably wasn't the character that it was based on. But that said, it's what people think. And so it's kind of accepted knowledge. And when I met Gregorio before he passed, and he was, I think, around 100 or so years old, we spoke actually, interestingly enough, his translator was his grandson. And here I was the grandson of his friend. And that was neat. But he totally took that to the bank. And I don't blame him. It was kind of his calling card was that he was the Old Man in the Sea.
What are you most grateful for right now?
This conversation, Tate.
Shut the front door.
No, I'm serious. It's nice. It's so nice to be able to just talk to somebody for a while. I mean, I'm not being facetious, but right now that feels like the greatest thing.
This is great, yeah. Being present with you.
But there's so much, right? I get depressed, and there's depression and mental illness in my family, and I totally have dealt with some of that personally, and I've seen family members deal with it, and one of my first half cousin, Mariel, is an amazing advocate for that. I just was tweeting with her yesterday, but because she had this great interview with the Daily Beast and was talking about various things, but how she's really become a champion for mental health because her full sister has a really tough time. And I think I'm so grateful for mental health and for health. And a lot of that, it's easy right now to get scared about health. And my mother always says, you have nothing without your health, right? So I am super grateful for that.
Knowing what you do now, having some wisdom under your belt, what kind of advice would you give your younger self?
That's a good question. I really think that the biggest advice I would give my younger self would be to be authentic and to really try hard to achieve authenticity. I think that one of the hardest things for me when I was a kid was doing that, was sort of accepting who I was and wanting to be the best person that I could be for myself, which that sounds corny, but truthfully, just to be honest with who I am and to not be afraid to show that to the world. I mean, I have daily affirmations, and a big one is to maintain authenticity and to strive for authenticity. Because when I say maintain, so much of the time I feel like who the fuck am I? I need to constantly remind myself of that, because I think there's always going to be, and it's not to sound paranoid or negative, but there's always going to be people and places and things that are going to kind of knock you off your balance in that way. And I think it's hard to be it's hard to be authentic sometimes. It's hard to be honest and see the world and express yourself as you walk through this world in an honest and authentic way. I've been a coward and a liar and an asshole. We all have, I think, on some levels, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that and then to strive to be better,
You say, who the fuck am I, when you're younger, and also living under this big shadow, and maybe people are projecting onto you what you should be or who you should be still?
Oh, yeah. No, certainly. And going to a religious boarding school, an all-boys boarding school, when I was very young, that was tough. My father wrote this copy of the book that he gave me of Papa. He called me Ted. He wrote, "For Ted, whom I love as much and perhaps more than anyone else, Pa."
Why did he call you Ted?
Oh, I guess because Edward, Teddy, it's like a nickname.
Teddy, Eddie,
but
Teddy,
yeah,
Eddie.
it's called me Ted. But I feel like my parents, a lot of times they didn't pit us against each other, but they definitely, and this might have been a cultural thing at the time, but the whole I love you as much and perhaps more than anybody. It's this kind of a quantification of something that now I'm like, just love me. Don't love me.
Tease.
Yeah, don't love me more than anybody else. Just love me. It's touching, but it's I don't know. It's a little strange, a little like disingenuous or something, but manipulative. I don't know. But I think people manipulate. We all do. And I don't want to be that way, but I'll do things like that. Or
You just kind of catch yourself in trying to make things the way you want them.
Totally. My biggest peeve with myself that I've noticed lately is that I have this ability to be passive aggressive, which I hate because it's the Irish Catholic politeness that I was brought up to be. And it's like, I appreciate people so much who are, not rude, but who are honest socially and aren't afraid of offending people because they're being honest, but not in a hurtful way or a negative way, just in an honest way.
Just good feedback.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I do aspire to be more like that. And I do actually think that kids are more like that. Like just by their nature, I think they tend to just be themselves and they are authentic. And I love that about them. And I love going to talk to kids about my books because I've noticed that, especially like an audience of second graders, God, they are so genuine. And they're so thrilled to see somebody doing something. Like when I show them a book that I made, like they draw pictures, they write words, they see somebody who's doing this on a large scale and who's, quote unquote successful at it. And it lights them up and they get very excited and they ask lots of questions. It's super inspirational for me too, because kids are really awesome.
I was going to ask you what the future holds.
I do feel like we have good things coming for all of us. And I'm really excited about finishing this book, which has been taking me forever, Pigeon and Cat, in stores in 2022. No.
I can't wait.
No, and then I have another project, Chums, which I'm working on, which I'm excited about. It's about two fish out of water who are good friends. But so, yeah, I'm excited to just do more work. And also I'm excited for more get-togethers and people being able to see each other, and parties and weddings and boat rides. Yeah,
just human connection in general.
Human connection. That's what I'm really excited for.
As Hemingway remarks, the very nature of making art and writing can be pretty lonely work. But that solitary space also fosters a level of presence, a surprisingly similar side effect of the pandemic. Both provide the opportunity to test oneself, to practice gratitude, to make the best of adversity. Creation inextricably tied to destruction, authenticity with inaccuracy. In patterns both reproductive and devastating, the ebb and flow of life cultivates a keening awareness of self, the passage of time and legacy. Eddie's legacy seems to be that of rebirth, making anew, with illustrations and stories both uniquely progressive and profoundly reminiscent of the moralistic golden books of yesteryear. Hemingway grapples with friendship, self, acceptance, and this crazy little thing called life, while helping future generations do the same. A huge thank you to our supporters: Susan Karstensen, Zocalo Coffee House, Whistle Pig Korean, Last Best Comedy, Hatch, Loken Productions, Ben Johnson Photography, Superfluous Industries, and Blunderbuss. A shout out to our media team: Allison Gregory, Pat Loken, Ben Johnson, Jessica Byerly, Shannon Hughes, Nathaniel Johns, Bryant Stersala, and Dylan Weber. Hey, Tate Chamberlin here. Thanks for listening and supporting I Am Interchange. We build our projects to align with the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. Do you have an issue that's riddled by gridlock in your community? Shoot me an email at tate@iaminterchange.org. That's tate@iaminterchange.org. Remember, share airtime and don't ruin dinner.